Last week, some Texans celebrated their state's open carry law by bringing their long guns into fast food restaurants. A National Rifle Association, NRA, staffer called this stunt downright weird. But the NRA's chief lobbyist later apologized to the rifleman. In 1934, the NRA president, Carl Frederick, said during congressional testimony on a bill to regulate sawn-off shotguns and machine guns, "I have never believed in the general practice of carrying weapons. I do not believe in the promiscuous toting of guns. I think it should be sharply restricted and only under licenses." That's a passage from a newspaper report from 2014. Commenting on the fact that the NRA, the National Rifle Association of the United States, which most people around the world associate with support for gun rights, has a long history of supporting gun controls. And even as recently as 2014, a staffer in the NRA could make a statement like that, condemning people for bringing guns into a restaurant. I'm David Olusoga, and welcome to Journey Through Time.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell. And that's right, David. Today we're looking at the history of an organization that in the United States is absolutely synonymous with gun rights, with rabid support for the constitutional right to bear arms, and is behind all of the legislation and all of the kind of Supreme Court decisions that people outside of the United States find so bewildering about gun control in the U.S. or the lack thereof. And basically what everybody thinks that they know around the world, really, in my experience, about how guns have always been in the United States is due to this group, the NRA. And what we're going to talk about is the way in which this group that everybody thinks has always been for gun rights, totally about gun rights, actually started out being about gun regulation, about gun safety. And we're going to tell the story about how that has completely changed on its head and why, and the consequences that's had for the U.S.
So it's a history of the NRA itself, but also of the misuse of history to create this false impression of the place of guns in American society.
Absolutely. It's the story of a mythology, how a mythology was created cynically, deliberately. And there's a really surprising history, a lot of surprising histories embedded into this. So our mission over the next 3 episodes is really to unpack this surprising history, not just of this organization, but really of guns in America is really what we're going to be talking about how we got from there to here. It's actually the story of how a convicted killer helped turn a group that was originally around sportsmen. It was around guns as sports, and how it got turned into this for-profit group that is all about militant defiance and, deeply ideological. So yeah, it's a story about myth making, as you said, and it's a story about marketing. It's a story about how guns have been marketed to Americans.
And become consumer products.
Absolutely. And they've become a kind of must-have consumer product for a lot of Americans that they see as kind of tied to their identity, that this is what it means to be an American, is to carry an AR-15. And in particular, they see it as being related to freedom, that it is strongly associated now in America's national imagination with freedom, but guns did not always mean freedom in America. And that's a really important part of the story that we're going to be telling. But all of these ideas, the idea that guns are about freedom, that it's all about your right to do this, that has been fueled by the NRA, the National Rifle Association. This has supported things like the militias that stormed the Capitol on January 6th, in 2021. It's helped prop up leaders like Trump, and it's bleeding into law enforcement. That's part of the story that we're going to tell. So the things that people are seeing in the news right now about, ICE agents in ski masks who are wielding assault weapons, militarized, kidnapping civilians in unmarked vans, this all kind of is part of the same history. And it means that, people toting guns around America make it very unsafe. Not just for its own citizens, of course, but for anybody visiting. I mean, I don't know about you, David, but more and more as I speak to Europeans about, visiting the U.S., they just say they're scared and they don't want to go because they think it's dangerous.
I'm so glad we're doing this history because as a British and American host, one of the kind of oddities, one of the huge differences between Europe and America, number one has got to be the relationship with guns. It's the thing that Europeans struggle to understand about the United States. And as you say, this is a present day reality that has been built on a distortion of history. And as historians, I think this is, our critical job is to show that history has been used and abused to create this mythology. But also this is such a big history and such a a big story. But this is our biggest series so far. This is 3 episodes. It's fittingly 3 episodes. And it's also a kind of social history because it gets us into lots of aspects of American and world history. It's about race. It's about the relationship between politicians and the people. And it's a story that takes us way, way back, not just into American history, but before the United States.
So the British colonists bring with them an inheritance from 1689, the English Declaration of Rights, which allows certain people to bear arms, but the phrase there that was used was suitable to their condition.
So shock horror, this is a story about class in Britain. Who would have thought it?
Yeah. Status is everything, right? It's about class and status. It's about religion. So if you're a Catholic in 1689, forget about it. You may not bear guns in the United Kingdom, but you can if you're a Protestant. So that's the inheritance that British colonists bring with them as they are building what will become the United States. This is a legal tradition that links gun ownership to public duty. It's there to operate as a collective self-defense if necessary, but it's not ever understood as a private right. This is not about individual rights. This is about a group's right to have certain kinds of protections. And at the same time, gun laws were absolutely widespread. And this is really crucial. It is not the case that people were just wandering around with guns at will. Gun law was everywhere. So colonists had to present their weapons at regular musters, which are inspections, basically. Safe storage was mandated. Boston, for example, banned having loaded guns in your home. So there were all kinds of gun regulations that today Americans would see as completely unacceptable and unrecognizable.
And this is another part of the history that has been expunged. The idea that gun control is as old as gun ownership in the United States is not something that we've come to believe because of this, the success of the NRA and other organizations in telling us that everybody in America from the arrival of the Mayflower onwards had a gun in their hand.
Yeah. Expunged is such a good word there, David, because what we're going to be telling over the next 3 episodes is the story of how certain really important histories got erased and they got deliberately rewritten. And expunged is exactly what happened here. And many colonies actually restricted the sale of arms to various groups. So, for example, a lot of them restricted sales to Native Americans. You couldn't sell guns to Native Americans. So there are these important restrictions, limits on gun rights from the beginning. And the militias not always, but most of the time, they tended to store their arms in central public arsenals. So, for example, in Concord and Boston. So it's not the case that everybody just has their guns in their homes, again, which I think is what the popular image is. But in the colonial America, they were probably in some kind of central collective public storage. And if something came up, you would go get your guns.
That was a critical feature of a key moment in the revolution, but we'll come on to that.
Yeah. It's also important to say that the colonial militias do more than just kind of like defend their settlements and uphold public order, although that's, mainly what they're supposed to be doing. They are also being used in kind of, let's say, less upstanding ways than that. So, for example, militias would hunt runaway slaves. They would seize native land, and some of them were offering bounties for native scalps. So it isn't the case that, some people now want to say that, the militias in the colonial period were only about public order and not about individual freedoms, but that's not entirely the case. And of course, what's really important about the way that militias and gun use are understood in America in this period is that it's based around muskets, right? I mean, we're talking primarily about, single loading muskets. So they're not practical for use outside of militia combat, outside of people in, ranked orders. That's what they're for. And so all of that understanding about guns and how guns are organized is behind the constitutional setup that is so important to the way that guns are understood in America today.
The technology of guns and its advancement is a key part of this story because, of course, people in the 1690s or the 1760s could not imagine modern guns. They were familiar with what are called smoothbore muskets, incredibly inaccurate at anything other than very short range, mainly useful in volleys with large numbers of soldiers. And most of all, even if you are a brilliant professional soldier, you'd be lucky to get off 3 shots in a minute.
Yeah. British listeners may not know this, but Americans who learn about the revolution, one of the first dates that we learn, everybody knows July 4th, 1776, but one of the other dates that we learn is April 19th, 1775. And April 19th, 1775 is when the shots were fired at Lexington and Concord outside of Boston. And that actually began the American Revolution. And it began because the British were marching on these little villages outside of Boston. But the part that people don't remember is the reason why the British were marching on these little towns is because they were storing the local weapons. It was the local arsenal, and the British Army was marching to seize them. And the rebels intervened to stop them from seizing the collective arms. And that's how the American Revolution started, is because they were marching on this collective militia stored arsenal.
Because they weren't stored in people's home. Because
Exactly.
because they collected them and they were stored under the authority of the militia.
Precisely. So that literally is what starts the American Revolution, is based on the ways that guns were understood at the time, right? Then there's an interim period during the revolution, as you like to call it, the War for Independence, where the U.S. doesn't have a constitution yet. Of course, it's not yet fully fledged. And so it was operating under what were called the Articles of Confederation, which was just the kind of contract that the colonies.
It's the deal between themselves until they defeat the British.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, an interim constitution.
Yeah, exactly. And they required that all of the states maintain well-regulated and disciplined militias. That's their language, well-regulated and disciplined militias, because the militias were the basis on which they were going to fight the British Empire. So each colony was mandated that it had to have well-regulated and disciplined militias. And that language is incredibly important for how the history unfolds.
And it speaks to the military reality of the late 18th century. Having guns is not how you win battles. You win battles by being able to use those guns tactically in volleys on the battlefield. So they understand that the discipline and the regulation is as important as the firearms themselves.
Yeah. Well-regulated is crucial. And this is a collective duty, right? In the absence of a national army, what they say is that white men are legally required to own firearms, but it's for public service, so that you can be called to public service.
So it's more about obligations than rights at this point.
Absolutely. And it would not be understood. They wouldn't understand our debate about rights. It wouldn't make any sense to them. So the revolution ends in 1783. We won.
We know. We remember.
Well, look, it hasn't turned out so well for us as part of this story anyway. So I should keep my jubilation under control, because you guys have turned out to be a lot saner in important ways. And this is one of those stories. But soon after the revolution ended, there was an uprising in Western Massachusetts. So, and this was really important for the way the Constitution unfolded, because they were literally kind of working on the Constitution and trying to figure out how they were going to organize this federal government. And this rebellion led by a Revolutionary War veteran called Daniel Shays. It was a tax protest, but it began with him leading an armed uprising to seize the arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. So it's armed disorder. He wants to go seize the arsenal.
Exactly as the British had tried to do at Lexington and Concord.
Exactly the same move. And so it exposes deep fears that it might not just be an enemy from without, like the British. It might be disorder from within. If you've got dispossessed or disgruntled citizens, that this is what they might do. So this is very much on their minds as they are writing the Constitution and thinking about how they're going to organize the relationship between the federal government and these local militias, and their kind of how they're going to create a national defense system without a standing army, because they didn't want a standing army. And this is where James Madison comes in. I don't know if have you seen the musical Hamilton, David? You must have.
Well, this is embarrassing. I was asked to review opening night, decided I was too busy, and didn't. And it's too painful a memory for me to go and see it. So I turned down free tickets to Hamilton on its opening night in London. So it's a painful memory. We
could have been there together, because I went there to review it and did not turn it down, because I had already seen it in New York. I saw it with the original cast, and it was extraordinary. So anybody who's ever seen Hamilton, unlike you, David, will now be picturing, when we talk about James Madison, are going to be picturing a big African-American man with a huge voice. And there's an irony there in the way that they cast Madison, because Madison was actually a tiny little white man. He was known for how little he was.
He was a strange figure physically.
He was. He was very important, incredibly consequential, nowhere near as famous outside of the U.S. as Jefferson, Washington, but he is an incredibly important framer. He gave us some of our most consequential constitutional orders, including the one that baffles everybody outside of the U.S. We can probably do something about this when elections are coming up, which is those electoral colleges that confuse everybody in national elections. That was his idea too. Anyway, so Madison is this little guy. He's 5'4". He's like 100 pounds, and he's got a big head for this like little body that they all kind of comment on. In fact, the novelist Washington Irving, who wrote Rip Van Winkle, which I assume British people have heard of, he called Madison a withered little apple John, like this little dried apple. But there's nothing small about Madison in terms of his thinking, right? This oversized head has a very big brain. He's brilliant. He's cool. He's analytical, really, really smart. And he was admired even among geniuses like Jefferson and Hamilton. People were like, this Madison.
Yeah. To stand out among the founding fathers, you've got to be bright.
He's really, really smart. But he also is a slaveholder. Like
many of the others.
Not all of them, but many of them. And that certainly shapes his thinking as well, and certainly shapes the electoral colleges. But that's a story for another time. If gun rights in America are complicated enough without trying to get into the electoral colleges. So it's Madison who writes the Second Amendment, the famous Second Amendment that people now quote all over the U.S. and people outside of the U.S. know as well. And he writes the Second Amendment in order to appease the people who are worried about a strong federal government. So what we might think of today as states' rights people, they don't want a federal standing army. They want to make sure that they have strong local protections. And so he builds in the idea of state militias into the Constitution.
And there's 2 drafts of the famous Second Amendment, aren't there?
Yeah. And they both say well regulated. So they both begin with the words well regulated. So the first draft of the Second Amendment is a well armed and well regulated militia being the best security of a free country. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But no person religiously scrupulous shall be compelled to bear arms.
Now, the only bit we remember is the right to bear arms, and that is the bit that has been promoted and pushed by organizations like the NRA. The well-regulated militia has been forgotten, as has that religious clause.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was the possibility of conscientious objectors in Madison's original thinking.
So people like Quakers who don't believe, who wouldn't take up arms, they are catered for.
They're
exempted. This is about arms and militias. This is not about gun rights as we'd recognize them today.
Exactly right. And that's why I think it's so useful to hear that original language, because it makes it so clear. He says being the best security of a free country. This is not about individual self-defense or freedom. This is about protecting the country. And that's what he's talking about. But then he revises it, and the final text of the Second Amendment is the language is a little bit more ambiguous. And that is what has gotten us where we are today, because what it ends up saying is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, the key point here, though, is that he's saying a well-regulated militia is crucial. In other words, it's not just that the language permits regulation. The language mandates regulation. It says it has to be well-regulated. That's what the Constitution is actually saying here. And as you say, the way that people understand it now, and we're going to talk about how this comes about, but the way that people understand it now is that gun regulation is unconstitutional. But the Second Amendment literally begins with the words well-regulated and says it should be well-regulated.
What he has in mind is militias as they'd work up until that point, with their guns stored centrally at places like Lexington and Concord.
100%. So it's a collective duty. That's what he is talking about. Now, there's also that language bear arms, which is really important. And historians have commented on that a lot too, because bear arms is also not a language that you use about an individual going hunting. It's not what a poacher does. You don't say the poacher was bearing arms as he, went into the forest. And as the historian Gary Wills famously said, one does not bear arms against a rabbit. Right? So it's not about hunting. It's not about the ordinary individual gun uses of the day. It clearly relates to military uses of guns.
And again, this is about obligations, not rights.
100%.
And obviously, obligations are a lot less fun than rights. But this is about your duty as a citizen in this new republic includes the obligation to carry arms, like bearing a responsibility.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Benjamin Franklin wrote just around the time of the Constitution in the 1780s, he wrote a letter saying that he was worried that Americans were much more concerned about their rights than they were about their obligations, that all they were talking about was these new rights they'd given themselves and nothing about their obligations. And I've always found that such a kind of prophetic thing for him to say in the 1780s. But the key thing here that all of the stuff that we're talking about with well-regulated and bearing arms, all of this is how the Second Amendment was understood historically in the United States all the way until 20 or 30 years ago. It has just changed. And that's the part that I think most people don't realize, is they think, oh, well, you're just arguing about 18th century meanings, but it's always been this way. It has not always been this way. The way that everybody today thinks of like how guns have always been in America is literally less than 30 years old.
And for most of American history, the Second Amendment wasn't that well known. Many people can quote it, and most people know that phrase, the right to bear arms. But it was a bit like the Third Amendment. You know, most people, if you ask most Americans what the Third Amendment is, which is about the garrisoning of soldiers in private homes, which is really a reaction to the way the British had behaved, many Americans wouldn't be able to tell you what the Third Amendment is. And I think that was probably true of the Second Amendment for much of American history.
It absolutely was demonstrably. I mean, you can go into the newspapers and you can just see that they're never talking about the Second Amendment. They're much more concerned about the First Amendment. But now most Americans, if you ask them on the street, even the First Amendment, which is about free speech and the right to peacefully protest, peaceful assembly, a lot of Americans today don't know what the First Amendment is, but they all know what the Second Amendment is. That's really where the NRA comes in, but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So basically what we need to know now is that we're going to do a very rapid fire through the 19th century because not that much changes.
Another military metaphor.
Yeah, no, sorry, exactly. We're gonna have a lot of military metaphors. They're going to be everywhere. But what happens over the first half of the 19th century is that this militia system very quickly starts to break down. It becomes very clear that it's not going to work, and a standing army starts to get built. So although the founders didn't want it, very quickly America starts to realize it needs a national army for its self-defense, and the militias just aren't. I'm going to do another military. They're not passing muster. See what I did there? And particularly it's the War of 1812 that reveals this. We've talked about the War of 1812 before. You guys burnt down the White House. I'm not going to let you forget it. But that really revealed the failure of the militia system because we almost lost that war. It wasn't working.
And in some ways, what it shows is it was never just about firearms. As I said earlier, one of the reasons why militia are proved to be ineffective is because military technology, gun technology in the early 19th century really only works if you can fire in volleys. These are really unreliable weapons for the most part. We're beginning to get rifles, but very often smoothbore guns. You have to have coordinated movements on the battlefield. Professional infantry units are far superior than the militia, and the British get to the White House and get to burn it down because this is a professional army.
Yeah. And America thought it didn't want a professional army. So the United States was trying to not have that. And actually the rise of the NRA has a lot to do with civilians in the army. And we'll get to that shortly. But first we have to understand as well, to be looking at the history of gun regulation in the U.S. is that all throughout this time, as the colonists and the settlers are moving westward, the new local and state laws as they develop through that westward movement, they still routinely regulate guns. And they particularly outlaw concealed weapons. So over the first half of the 19th century, state after state passes laws outlawing concealed weapons, saying this is dangerous. Why would you have concealed weapons? We're not going to let you do that. So there's a standard kind of history of gun regulation here that I would suspect historians of other countries, I mean, you could tell me, David, about Britain, but that many other countries would have a similar history of gradually saying we need to control guns. As we've got urban environments, guns get industrialized and mechanized. We need to start passing different kinds of laws. But the point is the United States was no different. It was doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and you see a difference between guns in rural environments where hunting is normal and legislation to stop them being carried in cities. You can see the repression of people carrying swords in the same period. As societies get urban, as they become less violent, people don't want you knocking around with a rifle and a sword. It's just normal. It happens everywhere. The United States is no different.
It was no different. It became different, but for a long time, it was no different. Exactly. We just mentioned the mechanization of guns. And of course, that's one of the things that happens that starts to change the story, which is in 1836, Samuel Colt patents the revolver. And the name says what it does, right? It can revolve and keep spinning.
Well, this is the classic Western gun with a 6-shooter, a chamber that becomes, part of the kind of, when I was a kid, we had toy Colt pistols because they were so ubiquitous and part of this cowboy myth that we'll be talking about later.
But it lets you fire multiple times without reloading. And you were talking earlier, David, about how important that is. We spoke about it in the Great Exhibition episode, actually, because Colt brought his revolver to Britain as part of the Crystal Palace and, won prizes for how great it was. But it really, really changes things. And his motto was about the individual. He said, God made man, but Sam Colt made them equal.
So this is the beginning of mythologization, that guns are about the rugged individual rather than militia and national safety.
Yeah. So this ideology of the American individual, which certainly predates guns and is part of the story of America at this time, starts to converge with guns through figures like Samuel Colt. And then about 20 years later, Winchester creates the repeating arms. Again, you've got these mechanized guns, so the Winchester repeating rifle. And at the same time, these ideas about American individualism are very much on the rise and shaping how things are going to go.
And it's out of this moment and sort of these developments that the original NRA is founded. We should take a break there and come back and discover how and why the NRA came into being. Welcome back. Now, Sarah, one thing that many people will not know about the NRA is it's actually copied from a British organization.
We're talking here about some differences between how Americans understand their history and how the British look at American history, or indeed the rest of the world. But I think even Americans who know some of the history that we're talking about, very few people realize that it actually begins with Americans in England, which is really funny. And it's Americans in England, as you say, seeing this thing called the National Rifle Association in Britain and thinking it's a good idea.
And the National Rifle Association of Britain still exists. It has a museum in Bisley. I've been to its museum. It has a big firing range, and it comes out of this very, very odd moment. Another thing which I think most people have forgotten about, which is that in the 1860s, there's what's called the rifle fever in Britain. There is a very unlikely, paranoia that Britain might go to war with France in 1859 because of an assassination attempt against Napoleon III. And it creates this fear that Britain's got a huge navy. It's got a large-ish army, but it's mainly Indians, and they're mainly out in the empire, and that the weak point of the British Empire might indeed be Britain itself. And so these middle-class guys get together and join these voluntary military units, and they sort of go off camping for a couple of weeks. And these are like stockbrokers and insurance clerks, and they get to play soldiers. They get to buy their uniforms and buy their rifles, because the entry into these units is that you can afford to do this, strictly middle class. But it creates this almost kind of recreation love of rifles. They actually hold their competitions, their marksmanship competitions on Wimbledon Common. I mean, had it taken off and become like the American NRA, Wimbledon would be a very different place with very different associations. Queen Victoria came to one of their gatherings. So the British National Rifle Association is the model for the all-powerful American NRA, and yet it is barely heard of in Britain.
That's so interesting. And I did not know that about rifle fever. So it's always the French with you guys. We have our mythologies, and it is always the French with the British, isn't it, David? But it's also safe to say that the British National Rifle Association is not running around the country urging people to bear arms against each other and to buy semi-automatic weapons, is it? I've never seen the National Rifle Association of Britain urge people to buy dangerous weapons.
No, it has a little museum all about gun safety. It's all about the history of guns. They are not a political organization by any means. And in some ways, that is rather similar to the NRA that emerges in America.
Precisely. That's exactly what they copy, right? And it's safety, as you say. So this is the thing that will amaze anybody who knows what the NRA is today, is that it began as a gun safety organization. It was set up to make the civilians who were joining the army in the Civil War, because the 1860s, England is worried about France, but in the US, we've got a very different conflict in the 1860s, which of course is our Civil War. And what they discovered was that the soldiers in the Civil War were not good at gun safety. They were actually hopeless. They kept kind of shooting themselves and each other, and they kept missing all their targets. And so as the Civil War was breaking out, there are these Americans in England who see the National Rifle Association and think, well, that's a good idea. We should have training in gun safety and in marksmanship. We should get, people should be just, better at it. And so that's the idea, but it takes them 10 years to get there because the Civil War is keeping the Americans a little bit busy. But at the same time, immediately after the Civil War, and what leads into the eventual power of the NRA, is that the gun industry is growing. It's growing because of the Civil War, and it's growing because of these innovations that we were talking about in the first half with Samuel Colt, with the Winchester repeating revolver. And so the gun industry starts to pivot increasingly to this consumer market that we were talking about in the beginning, to see themselves as marketing to individual U.S. consumers. And they start to market them as status symbols, as symbols of personal power.
And the country is, like all countries after a war, is awash with guns. And the technological aspect of the Civil War is that long guns that are rifled, where they have a spiral on the inside of the barrel, are potentially much more accurate than the guns of earlier ages. So the missing link is the skill to use them. The technology's taken a leap. When people look at how the Union Army had fared in the Civil War, they see incredible levels of inaccuracy, of a lack of marksmanship. And this is not really surprising. You're taking people who do office jobs, who work in, what are going to be proto factories, who are not used to an outdoor world, who aren't hunters, who aren't used to guns, and putting a rifle in their hand. And so it's unsurprising that this culture of marksmanship had yet to be developed.
So the Union Army records actually show that just 1 in 1,000 bullets that were fired during the war actually hit their intended target. So 999 bullets missed during the Civil War. And so the motivation behind the NRA was about let's get better at this, guys. And it's also about gun safety because they were harming themselves and each other. You're harming the guys on your own side because you don't know how to handle a gun properly. So all of that information starts to emerge after the Civil War, and they realize they kind of want to do something. But at the same time, we have 2 other things that are happening that all converge into the way that gun history in America is going to be shaped. The first is that people are increasingly still moving west. Settlers are continuing to move west. And of course, the country is expanding. And what that does is it fuels the frontier myth, right?
Because the expansion is a violent expansion, inevitably.
It's a very violent expansion. It's illegal in many ways. They're in contravention of all kinds of treaties with the native peoples. They've got all of these treaties that are in many cases a century old and older, and they're just abrogating them. They're just ignoring them, breaking them. Settlers are just going where they want to go, and the government is basically letting them do it. So there is a lot of violence as part of this. And of course, therefore, they are using guns as part of this. They are violently seizing land from native people, and they are using guns to defend their homestead as they see it, this land that they have seized and that they are now settling. And the government was very much supporting that. In fact, it incentivized it in important ways. So we have this movement westward, and then these stories start to be told that everybody around the world is familiar with, thanks to Hollywood, which are the stories of the Wild West. So all of these stories about the frontier myth begin to expand.
And we'll go into more detail about that in the next episode. In this moment, just after the Civil War, the other area where violence is breaking out and guns are becoming synonymous with the way that society is developing is, of course, in the South, the defeated Confederate States.
Yeah, exactly. And you know a lot about this too, David. This is such an important moment in American history. It shapes so much of our politics and our culture today is the aftermath of the Civil War and what happened after 5 million Black people were freed and the country could not decide what it was going to do about that change in its establishment. And in the South, what it meant was that the South had been defeated, but its ideas about its own racial hierarchies, its ideas about white supremacy and its own racial order had not been defeated. They were determined that they were going to maintain their racial order, and guns were central to that effort to reassert racial hierarchies, immediately in the aftermath of the Civil War. I mean, you got to remember, these are people who just went to war to fight for their right to keep, speaking of rights-based arguments in the U.S., to fight for their right to keep enslaving people. And then, we skip the part of history where the same individuals are told that they should share power with them in legislatures, that the people that they had formerly enslaved, the same individuals. So they just weren't going to do that. And they use guns to restore what they see as the natural order, which is white people in charge and Black people as close to enslavement as they can get them, is basically what they try to do in the South. And there's a rise of militia groups that are central to this effort, the most famous of which is the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, there were many of these groups, but one of them is burnt into American mythology and history.
Yeah. And it's really important to understand that there were many. The Klan is just the most famous, but there are all of these militias that were operating in the South working to restore that racial order. The Klan is a group of white resistance. That's how it sees itself. And these militias pop up partly to fill the vacuum that's left by the Confederate military's defeat. So they want to have these other armed pockets of resistance. And so the gun ownership and this idea of armed resistance in the South become very racialized. So they are disarming freed Black men and some women, presumably, but they are violently disarming them by force or by intimidation.
And there are attempts at gun legislation in this period after the Civil War, aren't there?
So what's important to know is that the Klan, this first Klan, there have been many, unfortunately, many iterations of the Klan, but this first one, there were really important laws that were passed as the federal government tried to suppress the Klan and actually pretty successfully prosecuted Klan leadership. And they passed really important laws to suppress vigilante violence. Now, those laws weren't always upheld, immediately afterwards or even long afterwards, but they're part of the effort in the North to try to control vigilante violence in the South. So there are various laws that are passed that are less about gun ownership and more about political violence, but they are an important part of these efforts to control what's happening, but they have limited effect ultimately.
And I think it's important that what you've got by the end of the Civil War, as we get into the 1870s, is you have two myths that have emerged. The myth of the white vigilante defending his womanfolk and his way of life against free Black people. And you have the many myths of the frontier, all emerging with guns playing a role and a distorted role in both of those key myths. And we follow where that myth takes America and how it becomes something that the NRA can distort and expand in later decades in our next episode.
We need to leave our story here with the NRA having just been founded. It is nonpartisan. It is an apolitical group that is focused on safety and training and discipline, trying to get, farmers from Ohio to be a little bit better at using their guns. And it's all about responsible gun use. And it's actually founded in that very same year that the government was prosecuting the first Klan. So these are all efforts at moving towards something that looks like safety. But as you say, they're also converging with this growing mythology of the frontier, of the Wild West, of this idea that guns are central to American identity. And how those two stories converge is where we will pick things up in our next episode.
Sarah, thanks for that. Join us for the next episode.
See you then.
Thanks for listening.